Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along Borders. It's a boxy geometric design that's going to break up that border into chunks, making it easier to manage, and it just goes to show that a design doesn't have to be difficult to be impactful. So let's get ready to quilt some straight lines. Well, straight-ish. To quilt the herringbone design, you're going to start by quilting a box. Quilt along the seam for a couple of inches, then cross to the other side, travel back, and then return to your starting point. Now I'm going to fill in the box going from one corner to the opposite, and I'm going to quilt a diagonal back and forth line. Of course, if you find it easier to go more vertically, I can twist the quilt ever so slightly, so I'm working more in a vertical or horizontal motion and fill in that area. I'm not necessarily quilting a line over, traveling, and coming back. Instead, as I approach the end of my area, I'm going to loop around and come back the other direction. So the line of quilting doesn't actually touch the edge of the area. I mean, it can, but it doesn't have to. Once I have my first box quilted, I'm going to travel along the seam about a ½ inch or so and repeat, quilting another box, returning to where I started. Of course, you don't have to use a ruler to do this. What's great about this design is that it's stabilizing the seams as I go. Now I'm going to work my way to the other side by quilting my diagonal lines in the opposite direction. And again, I can just twist this part of the quilt so that I'm working in more of a horizontal movement. If the thought of just making up your boxes as you go kind of freaks you out a little bit, you might find a stencil like this handy. Because what you can do is line it up on your border and quickly mark out your 2-inch or 4-inch areas that you can fill in with your boxes and your filler. Now here's the one thing I really want to point out. It's the difference in density between the filler and the space between the boxes that gives this design such a cool texture. So if I'm quilting my back and forth lines about 1/8 of an inch apart, I want to make sure that the space between the boxes is about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch. This difference is going to make that unquilted area pop out, and that's what gives this design a great secondary pattern and a beautiful texture. And there's a couple different ways you can use this design to turn the corner. In this instance, I'm going to quilt directly off one side and then bring the next side in going the opposite direction. But here in a second, I'll show you another option for turning the corner with this design. And then just like I've already done on the other side, I'm going to travel along the seam and quilt my next spot. Now let's see how easy it is to quilt this design on the long arm. The main difference between quilting this on a sewing machine and a long arm is the fact that I need a ruler to quilt those diagonal lines. If I don't use a ruler, it's going to look very organic. And there I have my first box. I'm going to travel down the edge about 1/2 an inch. I love how I can use the reference lines on my ruler to help measure that out. And I can also use this direction to make sure that this line is going perpendicular to my seam. And repeat, go in the opposite direction. Now what I'm doing here is I'm letting the ruler control the amount of momentum of the machine. As I get to the end of my back and forth line and start to make my loop, I ease up on the ruler ever so slightly, let it shift, and then push back down. That's where this grip on the back really comes in handy. We all know it's fun and games until you get to the border corner. As I'm approaching the corner, I have to decide how I'm going to handle that area. For the most part, I'm trying to get my design to end on this inner corner. That way I can treat this section as a square instead of having it overlap and dealing with an irregular space. And it just so happens that it's working out that way. But even if it didn't, even if my last square was a little smaller or a little bigger, it would be fine. It wouldn't matter. While I can take the time to do some careful measuring to make sure that my corner looks perfect, I have to admit that I like to take the easy route. I'm actually going to quilt a completely different design in that square. I think some squares that echo in on each other would be perfect. Once I finish that border corner, I'm going to travel right on over, get back to the edge of the border, and continue doing what I've been doing already, quilting my boxes and those back and forth lines. Now let's talk about some variations. All we're doing is creating chunks and filling it in. You could use any filler that you wanted. like wishbones, petals, swirls, or even the wavy design we learned last week. The most important thing, no matter what filler I use, is that I know where I want to end up. You can also make your boxes different widths. You can make some skinnier and some larger. If you try this variation out, that you make sure there's enough difference between the size of boxes that it looks like you meant to do it, even if you didn't. Try playing around with the design and see how many variations you can come up with. And again, honestly, it doesn't matter what you put in there, just as long as you smash it down. Now let's turn it into a filler that's really going to smash down areas of our quilt so we can highlight other things. So I'm practicing on this quilt sandwich so I can show you what the design looks like, and then we're going to put it on the flower panel of our quilt. Normally, matchstick quilting is quilted across a whole area coming back, and that looks gorgeous and has a lovely texture. However, I get really bored quilting one long straight line over the whole quilt. So what we're going to do is take that line and break it up into columns. By managing it in columns, we're going to deal with the area that we're in so that we're not repositioning the quilt for one long straight line. But I'm going to quilt these lines so that they're different widths. This is important because I don't want them to look like they're all joined together at the same spot. But the last line is that I come along and start quilting up that second column. Since I'm quilting these lines at different widths, it's not clear where one column starts and the other column ends. Now I'm not making the lines actually touch. I'm leaving just a little bit unquilted in between because I love the texture that adds to the quilt. When I get to the top of my area, I'm going to continue quilting, extending that line out, and then quilting my third column, again trying to make them line up on one side and making them different widths on the other. What I love about this design is that it's so easy in how it goes together, but it has such an impact on your quilt. With all that dense quilting, it's really going to flatten down an area and make whatever it's around pop out. Let's use it on our flower panel to really enhance the shape of our petals. I'm going to quilt along the outside of the petal and echo it so that I have my defined edge. Instead of highlighting the whole flower at this point, like we did last week, we're highlighting the individual petals and the shapes that they make. And it doesn't even have to be a perfect echo. What we want is that unquilted area to pop, just like we had in our borders. Now it's time to start quilting our back and forth lines. Quilting columns with your back and forth lines will help you maneuver around your area. So what I can do is just quilt one column down and then another column back so that I can get out and move on to the next petal. Quilting that's beautiful and efficient is always going to be my favorite. So now it's smashed down that area. I have that nice outer ring really showing up. I think we should do it a couple more times. I'm using this pale green thread so that you can see what I'm doing. But if you're quilting along with me, go ahead and use a thread color that blends in. This is going to help you just see the texture as well as cover a lot of unintentional customizations. Now, if you're thinking, I don't love anybody this much to do this dense of quilting, just spread out the spacing between the lines to make it less dense. Since this background is so muted in color, I could just treat it all as one and do that back and forth line over the whole thing. But I think I want to have those defined petals just kind of work their way off of the area. So I'm going to just guess where they might be or create the ones I wish were there and add those back and forth lines, continuing until the whole thing is filled in. And for larger areas, you can add more echo lines and then add your back and forth lines. Now, of course, you don't have to add those back and forth lines in all the petals. In areas that I don't have quite enough room or I don't want to put that much emphasis, I'm just going to add more echo lines. That's what's so great about this technique. You can make it as complex or as simple as you want. And I'm just going to continue quilting in the petals of this flower panel by quilting along the outside of the petals, echoing the inside, and throwing in some back and forth lines where I think it'll look nice. See, I told you a design doesn't have to be difficult to be impactful. Okay, now it's your turn. So go ahead and quilt the herringbone design in the borders indicated in red in the diagram. Then use those back and forth lines in one of the ivory flower panels to highlight the whole flower, individual petals, or as a nice all over. And like always, I have a free quilting diagram and tip sheet that you can download. It's a great resource to have right next to you when you're practicing the design. Okay, so give it a shot. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll see you next week when we're going to use echoing and wishbones to add a little bit of a fancy touch to our borders. I'll see you then.